action!
Hi everyone and welcome.
Action!
What episode are we? I will answer that after the break.
Okay, we'll cut there for a moment.
Were you pulling down me?
It was jokes, man. I should probably start this camera over here.
Alright, go. Hi everybody and welcome to episode 25 of Knights of the Round Table. Today we are discussing the book The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Leguin. It is a science fiction book detailing the exploits of an envoy to an alien world that did not previously know there were other humans in the universe. And I would like to start with general impressions of the book. There's only two of us today, so it should be nice and short. Roll.
Okay, so I'll try to be as verbose as humanly possible. I was really looking forward to reading this book for quite a while. A lot of my friends told me it was really, really good, and I had only heard a few negative comments about it. So generally, I was expecting big things. But when I started reading it, I was kind of like, I'm not so sure that I'm going to really enjoy this book. And while it did get better towards the end, I found the first half of it a little bit slow and painful, really. Yeah.
I'm the exact opposite. For me, I had heard from friends that this wasn't a great book, and I had been dreading reading it for a while. But when I did start reading it, I'm like, oh wow, this is actually really good. I found her writing really easy to get into, and the ideas were really fascinating. The idea of an ambisexual human, sort of androgynous, might be male one mating session, might be female the next. That was really, really, really fascinating to me. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. It was a little slow in the beginning, but the ideas were so intensely interesting I didn't find out.
Her ideas were very good, and generally the book was extremely well written, but the first part of it wasn't really enjoyable for me, and I'll sort of go into why. It's normal in any sort of literature, for characters to have strange names, for places to have strange names, because you're making your own universe, whatever. But she also renamed a lot of other things in the world, the months, and
yes.
the more...
Well, they counted time differently on that.
Exactly. The more weirdness you bring into it, the more the reader has to process, go a little bit more slowly to realize what's going on. And that breaks up the flow a little bit. And she also had this dynamic where she was flipping back and forth between people's points of view. And that also slows things down a little bit. So for literally the first half of the book, there was a whole bunch of dynamics which were stop-starting the flow of the book, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. I didn't have much of an issue with the renaming of the months, etc., because the months all have different names in all the different languages of Earth. I liked that they counted time differently. Like one of their hours is something like 5 hours. And the only time the jumping between perspectives got me was the first time they went into Theron's, or what's his other name? The guy who dies. Spoiler alert. Esteban. When the first time we jumped into his perspective, I thought it was still the other character, and so I had to go back and wait, this doesn't make sense. And then about 3 paragraphs in, I'm like, oh wait, this is the other guy. Okay. And then after that, I had no issues whatsoever with the jumping perspectives.
Well, there was a couple of extremely short, 2 or 3 page paragraphs, but chapters. And some of those were a little bit non sequitur-like.
Yeah, all the myths, etc.
Yeah.
They were, but I really enjoyed them. Anthropology nerd though, so myth and folklore I love. And it sort of fleshed out the world a little bit.
How did you feel about, because when you start reading this book, the first thing you go into is basically this introduction. And normally introductions, are a couple pages here and there just to get you started. Her introduction is literally 9 pages.
is it? I have a different book, so is it Ursula who's the introduction?
Yeah, I believe so. And it's basically going on about
what sci-fi is and
what sci-fi is, how writers write, how psychology and philosophy and political thinking works. And I was sort of reading that, being like, woo.
Who was in?
Walking into a fantasy sci-fi book and having that sort of caveat introduced right before I even get into the book was a little bit off-putting.
Really? What, in what sense? What was off-putting about it?
It made me feel like I was reading a political science textbook.
Oh. Okay.
And I did a degree in that, and I still hate it. So.
Well, that's your problem. You didn't agree in that. I read, and I was just like, here's a sci-fi author who's telling us that sci-fi is the be-all and end-all of philosophical exploration and fiction. So I don't find it necessarily all that true. Well, science fiction really does address conversations with what's going on now and projects them into a future fantastical world. You can do the same thing with any speculative fiction genre. It's not just a science fiction thing, which gets on my goat when people say it is. So yeah, I just took it as a science fiction author saying science fiction isn't just a rollicking story, it's also a conversation with what's happening now and an exploration of the consequences.
One of the fascinating ways that she put that was actually, it was something along the lines of, it's all about telling lies.
Yeah, you tell the truth through telling lies.
Yeah, and that I really enjoyed.
Yes.
Not to give you guys the wrong opinion, I didn't hate the introduction, and I did find it interesting. It hit me a little bit hard right off the beginning, but it's definitely worth reading because there were some elements of it that were really interesting.
That's true.
So
also,
don't skip the introduction just because I was like.
Well, also on that thing though, you don't need to read the introduction to get introduction, because I can speak introduction to get the gist of the story. The introduction is not integral to the story. You don't actually need to read it if you don't want to. It's not like a prologue, where a prologue will set up the world and a mythology.
Okay, so we've introduced and dissected the introduction. Let's move in a little bit more to like the meat of the story. If you had to say what's the central theme of this book, what would you go with?
Oh geez, there were two.
Put her on the spot.
No, there were two. There were the ideas of patriotism and what that is and what that means, and the whole idea of gender roles and gender norms and what they are and how arbitrary they can be. So I didn't write it down because, well actually I did, but I left my notes at home because I'm prepared. There was a particular quote.
My disapproving look.
I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Where she wrote in, and I know it's from the character's perspective, where these people weren't behaving as rationally as a man would. They're kind of more like animals or women. It was literally animals or women, and I literally sat in bed and I went, really? Excuse me? Sorry, what?
I totally made a note of that too. When the book starts, they're sort of, introducing the reader to this idea that everybody on this planet is sort of, not really gender neutral necessarily, but
in gender limbo.
But can switch to both genders.
Yeah.
So when they're introducing it, they spend at least a couple of chapters being like, saying kind of derogatory stereotypes, slamming both men and women. And it was sort of unexpected, and I too was sitting there being like, I'm not sure how this is going, but then later, once you realized the whole gender topic of the book, you start to be like, okay, that's from the character's point of view.
Yes.
That's how they're introducing us to.
Yeah, and you can tell because during the same character's sort of thoughts, I think this is when he's on the ice with S01. And he's going across and he's sort of thinking about this bizarre being neither male nor female, not man or woman. He talks about these people as being not as burdened as women are on his planet and not as free as men are on his planet, and that stuck out for me quite a bit. It's an interesting look on gender roles, because he does say also when he's trying to explain what it's like to be a pervert all the time. For those who don't know, a pervert on this particular planet is somebody who is always one gender and never goes into the sort of neutral limbo, which these people are in most of the time.
Once again, in the beginning of the book, you're like, wow, pervert, that's really harsh.
Yeah.
But then you start to realize where they're going with it.
Yeah.
It is important to say, though, like she was saying about once the characters are crossing this ice floe together, and that happens later on in the book, people, their point of views start to get a little bit more friendly, and understanding sort of, for the first time, really clicks. It's one of those things where two people who don't necessarily have anything in common, and even are literally aliens from different worlds, through shared experiences can really come together and have that sort of rapprochement kind of idea. And I like that she made a point of doing that, because of how the beginning of the book was so very much we're worlds apart, and the whole idea of gender being worlds apart to begin with. Yeah. Gives us hope.
Yeah. I really liked her question about patriotism and how it's not really love of the country, because if it was, then you wouldn't stop loving the country the minute some arbitrary line was drawn across. She talks about patriotism rather being that it's not so much the love of the land as it is the hatred of the other. So it's not that arbitrary line that divides you and yours from there and theirs is what patriotism actually is, and has nothing to do with love whatsoever. It was a really interesting idea to explore.
I'm not really sure I'm sold on that definition. Then again, in a lot of things, I prefer to look at it as the positive rather than the negative. So I'm perfectly happy believing that patriotism is love of country rather than hate of other. As for these two nations, though, they are pretty radically different, even though they're made up of the same people. You have Carrière, I guess that's how you pronounce it. And Estrevan at one point has this quote where it says, it's not a nation but a family quarrel.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really interesting way of him explaining how his political and social society works. That's cool.
See, I'm more likely to think of patriotism as a hatred of the other, because it does stop at arbitrary lines. The way Estrevan was talking, he loves the country, he loves his country, he loves the way the sunlight hits the hills, and then he said, but how can I stop loving that if there's some line drawn and half the hill is some other nations? I don't stop loving that. That's not what it's like at all. And that's why it seems that his alliances are quite fluid, because it's not so much about being from Carrière as opposed to these people. It's about loving what's, how can I explain it? It's loving what's there and all of it in its totality. And then all these screams of patriotism in Carrière when what's-his-face takes over, Tide, however you pronounce it.
I was going with Tide.
Yeah, I switched. I'm like Tide or Tide, one of the two. When he starts screaming about patriotism, and what he's really using it is a call to war. Because it's not, and he screams patriotism, but what he's actually saying is not love of country, it's hate of other. And that happens in political rhetoric in the here and now too, if you listen to the radio. You're not a patriot because you don't support the war in Iraq. First of all, it's Iraq, and no, I don't.
Because Iraq is something completely different.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, so it's a political rhetoric that I hear often where patriotism is screamed as, and everybody takes it as love of country, but what it's actually being used for is hatred of other.
I mean, like so many other things, it's a political tool. then you get into that awful definition of who is a true patriot.
Right.
And so many times a true patriot is defined as the person who's willing to go so far beyond what is normal and logical and become really, really extreme. And that's not a good thing.
Well, sort of. Although, nothing to do with the book, but I used to watch a sci-fi TV series called The First Wave. And in it, aliens were invading, but they had one character in there that they had branded a traitor, the aliens, because he was helping humanity. And he claimed he was not a traitor at all. He was a true patriot because he was sticking with the original mandate that the aliens had before it became like an aggressive invasion. So the idea of patriotism is really fluid, and it's interesting to see it explored in a completely alien world where you can sort of detach yourself from it.
Well, essentially that's what happened to Estraman.
Right? Yeah.
He was a true patriot, and he got branded a traitor because
he was trying to make things better for Carhide and its people. Yeah, exactly.
We have an accord.
I demand a parlay. Okay.
How did you feel about the other nation? The bureaucratic and censor-driven...
very organized sort of nation. I don't know, because it's not mine, I was kind of neutral about it. I'm like, okay, yeah, giant bureaucracy where they control pretty much everything that everyone hears and therefore what they think.
Just essentially, just so, for people who haven't read the book, because we're walking on talking, about something you might not know, but the first nation that they end up in is Carhide, and the people are, more open, and everything is dispensed, all information is dispensed publicly. I mean, there's a twist on it. They're telling people what they want people to hear. But it's much more of an open communicating society. Whereas then later in the book they go into
something to do with that.
Something like that. Into the second nation, which is extremely bureaucratic. And when they make the transition to the border, your first thinking is, this place is very organized, a little bit too organized maybe. But once the main characters start getting into the politics of it, you realize that as opposed to the free information sort of first nation, the second nation is very secretive and super censored.
Yes, and it's sort of the it's organization, like extreme organization, which we might consider more civilized, but it's not. They have the voluntary farms, which are not voluntary farms at all. They're basically slave work camps and things like that, that nobody really talks about, but everyone knows about, that they literally just shove people off there to die. And so while it might seem very civilized on the outset, when you get into the heart and the meat of the way it's organized, it's not civilized at all. It's really very brutal and cruel.
If we really want to go there, we can say that the two different political systems were another version of male and female, and at the end of the book where they're pushing the two political systems closer together via a treaty with an alien power, it's getting more
violent.
I was going to say more gender neutral.
More, really, yes.
So you can do it like that.
Yeah, that's actually, that's really good. I didn't even think about that. He's got brains. Okay, if you were to give it a rating out of 5, what would you give it?
I'd have to go to 3.
Okay. That's no particular justification.
Okay, fine, I'll justify it. Like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of good concepts about this book. There's a lot of parts about the book that were interesting, but because of its flow problems that I felt were there, I can't really justify giving it a 4, although conceptually and writing-wise it really does deserve a 4.
Okay, fair enough. I gave it a 4. I didn't find it blocky or chopped up much at all. No different from any of, say, George R. R. Martin, who keeps bouncing between characters. and his timelines don't even match. At least in this, the timelines matched, except when they were talking specifically about the mythology of the land. So,
disregarding all the back and forth, yes, the timeline was constant.
So, I gave it a 4. This writing style is super easy to get into. The concepts are really fascinating. It really does make you sit and think for a bit. And it was a great read for me. I finished it in a little under 8 hours. So 2 days of reading in between doing other stuff. It's a good book. I really enjoyed it. Great.
I think I hit in at about 11 hours, and that's a long read for me.
When we were doing what's that book that's nothing but rape and Stockholm Syndrome? Into the Gap. We were doing that. It's a short book. It took me forever to read because it was just...
Rape and Stockholm Syndrome. I guess I missed that book.
Yeah, it's you learned on Olsen. It's an earlier episode. You can go watch it. Next book is?
And then the next book is...
Carrière by Tamara Pierce. By Tamara Pierce. So, we will actually not be reading this until, or you will not be reading this, uploading this. You'll not be watching the episode of Carrière by Tamara Pierce until September because we're all going on summer break. Yay! We'll see you then. Bye! Oh wait, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now bye.